Derby Day defeat for Norwich City, the first time in 16 years. 3-1 at Portman Road, which has posed plenty of questions about where Norwich City find themselves currently, but also about where they're heading as a football club. 19th in the table, 8 points from 9 games. Whichever numbers you look at, stats, graphs, but even the eye test is not offering a lot of positivity about where this Norwich City group currently stands. Welcome back to the PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast. I'm your host, Connor Southwell, joined by Paddy, Davitt and Samuel Seaman 24 hours or so after that Derby Day defeat in Suffolk. Paddy, I asked this sincerely and not flippantly. Where on earth do we start this week? Because there is so much to dissect and discuss and mull over. Yeah, what a sorry situation this is.
It is, but what I'm thinking is, are we surprised that we sat here now, Monday morning, dissecting another performance in the loosest sense of the word from a Liam Manning Norwich side in terms of the identity, in terms of on the ball, because all of these things, I mean, me and you did a bit of a tactical, a data deep dive, shall we say, here on the PinkUn podcast only last week, and all those rather concerning metrics in terms of ranking where this Norwich group are now in the whole of the Championship, in terms of, sort of possession, chance creation, final third entries, touches in the final third, expected goals for and against. And so probably the saddest element is we're sat here to dissect a defeat, which I don't think any of us didn't expect. We all predicted, well, me and you certainly did, Connor. I'm assuming Sam was the case, but we predicted a home win for Ipswich, the end of that 16-year dominance. Although, McKenna was quite keen again post-match to push they haven't played each other for 16 years and we were in the Premier League and they were so on and so forth. So, but let's not split hairs. The reaction inside that stadium, his demeanour as well. He's not the most demonstrative of head coaches from any time I've seen him in front of the media. He was like a Cheshire cat yesterday post-match, great for the town, a box ticked, the whole Nunes factor, the scale of the celebrations surrounding him, all of those factors indicate it was a big deal, this 16-year thing. But back to Norwich, for me, more importantly is, yes, okay, that episode now is done. Move on. We'll have another chance at maybe setting a record straight in terms of Norwich when they come to Carrow Road in 2026. That's all well and good. But it's now, and it always has been for me, is what the season looks like, where it's heading, what this head coach is trying to do, the sporting director, his people, the people above them, the whole top to bottom, on and off the pitch. And yesterday just probably brings it into the sharpest of sharp focuses because it's their bitterest rivals, and they can revel in that misery that they can see over the other side of the border, which hasn't been the case in these past 16 years. So, sad as it is, Connor, not surprised. And that in itself is a worry, that we're not surprised that we sat here today dissecting a Norwich Derby defeat. And not only that, but no debate about who were the better team, no debate about which team looked well coached, which team looked like they had an idea of what they were trying to do in terms of in possession, chance creation, the quality of individuals they had in those attacking areas, namely Philogene, of course, and one who was all the opposite of those things. And that's why it wasn't just a 3-1 Derby defeat and could have gone either way. No, that was a result which underlined, sadly, right here, right now, two clubs who seem to be on different trajectories. And I've just done on our PinkUn TikTok channel, I've done a debrief there the morning after the night before. And on there, I've said, effectively, you come away from that game and there's only one of those two clubs and one of those two teams and coaching staffs who were looking like geared up for the top 6, and it's not Norwich.
No, it isn't. And actually, if you look at the graphs and the stats, it's the bottom 6 that Norwich City need to worry about right now. But we'll come on to that in a little bit of time. And Sam, I mean, Paddy, for me, is a pertinent point there. I was speaking to some of our town colleagues who are obviously cock a hoop after the final whistle. You can understand why it's been such a long time. And one of them asked me, "Oh, how does it feel?" And actually, you try not to sound bitter or of any kind of sense of irony. This is genuinely, and probably likewise for you, really, the first time I can consciously remember Ipswich beating Norwich. I say that not to gloat for any blue and white listeners that have maybe tuned in for reasons of their own enjoyment, and hello to you all. But genuinely, I think that a lot of focus over the last few years has been about that, has been about what would a defeat feel like, what would it look like, and Paddy's touched upon it there. I think certainly for me, I can't speak for a whole fan base; they can only speak for themselves, and this is why I'm intrigued to get your take on it. But it didn't really feel that big a deal, or maybe as seismic as I thought it was. And I think it probably goes to the heart of what Paddy said there. It's not because it doesn't matter and it's a rivalry that of which Norwich don't mind about or anything like that. I think it gets to the heart of where Norwich are at the moment, where there's this numbness and probably expectation that actually what unfolded at Portman Road was exactly what we all expected anyway. So in many ways, I feel like I'd kind of made peace with the fact that this was going to happen weeks, months, I don't know about years, but definitely months ago. Did you kind of feel the same when that full-time whistle went at Portman Road yesterday?
I think I probably did, and I kind of agree with you in terms of the way I thought it would feel for the Norwich City fan base going into it, because I've been saying this sort of going into it. Really, I think you look at it objectively, it's hard to argue that this isn't the lowest the club has been since it got relegated to League One in 2009, and this was for me quite a tangible moment where it was no longer the club that's competing for promotion in the Premier League, no longer the club of cliches about, this is a good side at this level and they'll always be in and around it. For me, this kind of underlined, because it was the end of that 16-year link from, through all of those teams who have been competing for promotion throughout all that time, that it put in definition all of Norwich City's problems. So I expected it, when you think about it in that way, to feel like a really big moment, to feel almost like a watershed where Norwich fans would look back on, all of the struggles of the last few years, particularly since they were obviously last relegated from the Premier League and everything that's gone wrong since then. And I think, to be honest, the mood of resignation and disappointment and of kind of soul searching about the club as a whole, I think maybe subconsciously is as a result of what's gone on over the last few years. I think if they had, if they'd lost under David Wagner, yes, there would have been, I think there probably would have been more actually immediate fury at Wagner, at Ben Napper at the time, who obviously had only just arrived and not sacked Wagner, at the squad of players. But now I think because they've had so many years in the Championship, because there's been that, that build up of things that have gone wrong, I don't think there was that immediate fury. I think it all plays into the context, obviously. But for me, when I spoke to fans after the final whistle, the main thing that I sensed was worry going forward. And maybe that's also an indicator of the fact that in football, you can't really afford to ever look back for too long. And it's always about kind of what's next. But I think a new reference kind of worries about potentially being in a relegation battle and how some of the numbers suggest, that might be a worry. I think Norwich fans aren't thinking about the fact that, this is the end of a time of, real excitement and competing for promotion and things. They're worried that it's going to get even worse and that, there might even be a repetition of that relegation to League One. Maybe there is a poetry in a sense to the fact that the last time Norwich did lose to Ipswich, that was in a Championship season in which they got relegated to League One. So I think there is a worry about the direction of the club, about when things are ever going to turn around, because they've now completely overhauled a squad of players, probably twice really since they were last relegated from the Premier League. They've had 4 head coaches. None of them have looked particularly convincing so far. And I think Norwich fans are now wondering where things go from here. And it's probably an apt comparison with Ipswich, because they obviously went into that whole Marcus Evans era. And I saw some Norwich fans on social media last night suggesting that might be the time for Norwich. And for me, that really is the worry. And that's been the worry basically since they last came down and there was kind of the uninspiring Dean Smith era. Has been, yes, I know there's kind of the League One worry, and that would be even worse. But for me, it feels like Norwich are now almost already one of those run-of-the-mill Championship teams that swirls around that plug hole for years and years and is trapped in the Championship for maybe a decade or more. I think Norwich fans are now realising that that's quite a distinct possibility, and things need to really change in a big way for that not to happen. So I think probably the sense of worry for the future is why it didn't feel like as much of a watershed in the present. But I think the context of it and the severing of all ties now pretty much from an era when Norwich were competing for promotion to the Premier League on a regular basis, when they were in the Premier League, a few seasons, obviously. I think, I don't think that helped.
No, I agree, and I think we could sit here and dissect the game, and I think if we were to do that, we would say, well, in the first half, Norwich pressed well structurally, they were okay. I thought second half they were poor, really, in terms of just the lack of creation and imagination about the team. As well, and we'll come on to probably more of those points. But for me, that kind of misses the point, because for that to be the bar, really, that's an okay performance, and they've been not just beaten but comfortably beaten, really, by their arch rivals, who, yes, have obviously been in the Premier League a lot more recently than they have, and spent money. Norwich have too, by the way, and for that to be the gap and the distance, I think it says a lot about where Norwich City are and where the bar is at the moment, to be completely honest. I can't really think, unless you, boy, there was one from Mirko Topic that he dragged wide in the second half, and obviously the goal that Oscar Schwartau scored, I wouldn't necessarily define that as a huge opportunity that Norwich had. I don't really remember Alex Palmer being worked a huge amount in that game. And again, it's those similar issues. And I mean, Paddy, you said it in the team news video, really, that if Norwich City were to keep their unbeaten record against Ipswich, it would be probably one of the biggest sticking plasters you can have imaginable. Results often do that, but actually, when we came back from the post-international break, all of the problems that we've seen and spoken about in the 9 games preceding this would still be there, and those are true. And now it feels like the fact that Norwich have been beaten, and like you say, that expectation, that resignation of it, and let's be honest, I think the feelings that Sam says of disappointment, of underwhelm, that's existed in this fan base for 4 years, 5 years, since that Premier League campaign, and really since the departure of Daniel Farke, and maybe we could chart it even before that, and the sale of Emi Buendia. But you boil it down quite simply. Sam maps out there, Norwich have had 4 head coaches, they've had 2 sporting directors, this is their second ownership group. They've spent millions upon millions upon millions on players at championship level. They've had another summer where they've spent a considerable sum of money. Yes, of course, you have to balance it with the fact that they've got good fees for players. And I don't think anyone disputes that, but they have invested heavily into this squad. And yet they've continued to tread water, continue to regress. There's been one season where they finished 6th under David Wagner, but let's be honest about it, got absolutely battered in the playoffs. They were nowhere near promotion. Why has this, for such a long period of time, gone? And I recognise this is a big question, but why has this, over such a long period of time, gone so wrong for a football club that, over years before that, had got it so right at this level, and had kind of been able to strike that balance between identity and what it means to follow and support a football club and have that definition of such, but also combining that with success? Because at the moment, a lot of Norwich City fans are seeing a football club that, for some of them, and again, you can never, whether it's 51%, whether it's 99%, you can never say. But for a bulk of them, they don't really recognise what they're seeing at the moment in terms of direction of travel, and there's certainly not much success to get their claws into. It's a pretty fatal concoction, that, in terms of how your fan base is going to feel about where they're going and their direction of travel, I think.
Well, I mean, all of those words, one word you said above all encapsulates, and the word is identity. What defines or what separates Farke and the Webber era, when it was good, from everything that's gone before, subsequently. Different head coaches, different sporting directors now, different playing staffs. Can you honestly say any of those iterations have an identity to what Norwich are all about, what they're striving to do? And not just that, when I talk about identity, because that's an easy label to throw around, but it was a brand of football under Farke, which at its best was as good as anything I would venture that maybe a Norwich fan has seen, and I'm going way back now, probably since the Walker era and that Premier League season. And that's obviously, ruling out a large swathe of the younger fan base. But in terms of stylistically, that was entertaining football, that was goal scoring. It wasn't always perfect, and of course, we got found out in the Premier League, but then there's lots of factors in terms of that first Premier League season. They clearly was nowhere near what was required in terms of squad, and they didn't spend, and we know the reasons for that. And Second time around, he was jettisoned before early part of November. So nobody can really say how that would have panned out that second season under Farke. It wasn't tracking on a path that made you think it would end any differently. But again, the plug was pulled. And then it was the handbrake to Dean Smith, a Premier League, so Stuart Webber hoped, a Premier League seasoned head coach who would have that pragmatism that maybe Farke lacked and maybe wouldn't be about so much the philosophical, aesthetic, pleasing style of football. It would be effective football and it would keep Norwich in a division. How did that go? And then it continued down that path to Wagner, to then again Stuart Webber replaced by Ben Napper. We handbrake again to Johannes Torp. Very similar in parallels to me to the Farke experiment. Let's think outside the box. Let's go overseas. Let's go progressive. A coach who has a clearly defined style of play. We're going to stick with him. We're going to build something. It's going to be beautiful football. It's going to be, as Ben Napper said when he first came through the door, what the type of football he likes. Controlling possession, controlling the ball, creating chances, high intensity, front foot, good pressing. And this is the guy now, this unknown guy from Denmark is going to come in and drive this forward. 10 months down the track, we rip that one up and then we pivot again, handbrake it to Liam Manning. The hope being that you had then a championship grade, having got Bristol in the top 6, domestic coach who understands what the championship's about and maybe some of the areas that they thought Torrent was lacking in. This guy will fill in the gaps. And okay, we're not bringing down the definitive judgment on the Liam Manning and tenure. For me, that would be premature. 8 games, 9 games in, but it's not looking good. So there is a very potted history for me. That is why in answer to your question, Connor, why has these last 4 years been, bar the odd brief interlude, unending kind of misery and almost fighting with yourself as a football club? What are we? What are we striving to be? What we trying to be? What we trying to project outwards? In terms of a Norwich team who goes on the pitch, this is what they're all about. This is how they'll strive to play. Won't always get it right. Won't always be successful, but it will actually be optimistic. It'll be progressive and forward thinking, and they'll try to do something different. So maybe as they did under Farke and Webber when it was good. No, they broke out of the pack. They tried to get ahead of the curve, and they successfully did it. And then you saw lots of other clubs in the Championship certainly trying to emulate the Norwich model. There'll be nobody trying to emulate what Norwich have done in the last 4 years. It'll be, don't do that, because that ends in Stoke, Ipswich for that long period in the second tier, multiple other clubs, my club, Coventry. And it won't just end there for some of these clubs. We've seen it again. And Norwich themselves, you go back another step to League One and maybe even worse than that. So that effectively is what this boils down to me. And there was a brilliant column in the last few days, 2 or 3 brilliant columns in the fan space. I referenced it in my pointers, and one of them was about that. Where is the identity now? What do Norwich stand for? And not just in terms of on the pitch, but off the pitch. And we don't need to open this up into the PR gaff that was the Carrow Road ground expansion plan, longer term, and how that was handled, and how that was messaged, and the timing of that 2 days before a derby is frankly staggering. But again, for me, as I said in my pointers, it feels like it's a club that no longer is listening, and they're not actually. They can say they consult fans, they can say they're bringing fans on the journey, and we want you to buy into this vision, but they're not buying into it because they don't see any tangible evidence on the pitch or off the pitch in the period that this is improving. So that disconnect will continue to grow. I made the point as well in my pointers, the last home attendance below 25,000, first time in 14 years. You can package that any way you want if you're looking at it internally, and it's a midweek and kids have to be up early for school, da-da-da-da-da. If Norwich have started this season very well, do you think there's less than 25,000 in for Carrow Road, for West Brom midweek? No. So clearly it is the product on the pitch. It's what's happening off the pitch or what's not happening off the pitch. And that, unfortunately, is only going to continue in a regressive trend unless those at the top of this club get a handle on this now and see the massive red warning lights that are flashing and do something about it and not message what people want to hear. No, it's tangible actions now, I think. And that can be many things. It can be personnel moving on in key positions. It can be a reset in terms of the values and the behaviours and the culture of this football club. But, let's not kid ourselves that, this is just a small fork in the road. This is potentially Norwich for the next 5-10 years if they don't get to the bottom of the root causes of stagnation effectively for the last 3 or 4 seasons. address the issues, be honest, be open. Liam Manning often talks about in terms of his his responsibility. We need to look in the mirror. We need to be honest with ourselves, even if that hurts, and that truthfulness is going to, be uncomfortable. But that's the only way you get through what he's trying to get through on the pitch. But I would also equally say maybe off the pitch, they need to have a process along those lines as well.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's no longer red warning signs. I think it is now red warning signs, sirens, noises, people with things on fire, waving things in the air, trying to get attention to this. That's kind of where it feels like we are, and I kind of circle back to where we started this conversation. It all feels like it's kind of been an inevitability that Norwich would end up here, and not necessarily with this Derby Day defeat, but this was the pattern, this was the trends, this is what everything was showing. And for me, I think you touched upon a good point there, Paddy. And I remember writing a piece, might even have been when they were back in the Premier League, about them trying to find the how again. And you hear a lot about, well, we want to be in the top 6, we want to get back to the Premier League. Well, of course you do. Everyone wants to do that. For me, it's the how. How do you do that? How are you going to get there? And for probably the last few years, there's been very little detail on the how, and it's felt like all we have had really it's been about the development of players to try and sell them on, really, rather than perhaps trying to build a squad that is capable of winning games. And of course, if you do that, then a byproduct of that is you're going to develop and nurture players. You look at a lot of those players in this squad at the moment in time, and it will come on to the recruitment side of it in a little while. It's difficult to pinpoint 3, 4, 5 maybe that are going to recoup their value. That's kind of where we are with it. And and for all the kind of the talk of ambition and money spent, for me, that's kind of the easy bit. Anyone can have money and go and throw it around and go and sign players. But for me, that's not ambition. You need to have execution behind that. You need to have a plan behind that, something that's coherent, something that threads it all together. And I think that is why for bulk of last season, obviously it got bad towards the end with Johannes Torp, but there was a buy-in, there was an acceptance that this was going to take time, because I think people could see a process. Now, whether you liked or didn't like that process, whether you liked or didn't like the style of play, and whether you did or didn't think it was going to be a success, we turned up every week at Carrow Road knowing what a Norwich City team was going to look like, kind of knowing the plan as to how they were going to try and drive it forward. And again, only for that to get kind of blown up 8 months into it, I think you have to ask questions about where they're at, and I think that ultimately, Sam, is where the fan base is at, isn't it? Because for all of the reasons that we've discussed at the moment, and we will come on to some of the Carrow Road stuff later, because I do want to talk about that a little bit. It's difficult to shake the feeling that, forget treading water. I mean, actually, I'll use this anecdote. I was setting up to do my verdict yesterday, and there was, I won't name the person because that's unfair, but they cover Norwich a lot, and I speak to them a lot, and they're not a Norwich fan. They come from the outside, sort of looking in. So this is why I think this is a useful anecdote. And as I was setting up, he sort of came across and he went, blimey, this football club is the word he used. And I was going, yeah, it wasn't great, was it? And he's going, I don't even mean the game. I mean, in terms of where it's going and the chart that it's kind of the course that it's been on over the last few years, and just how miserable it has been to kind of cover, let alone follow as a fan. And I think that's almost, sometimes when you're inside, you can almost kid yourself a little bit that maybe it's not as bad as you think, or there is enough mitigation, or as Paddy says, well, actually it's under 25,000 on a weeknight. Well, maybe there was a bit of traffic, or maybe it was a bit cold, or it was a school night. You can kind of kid yourself, Sam, can't you? And as Paddy says, it feels like this should be the moment where a lot of reflection is done about where this football club finds itself at the moment.
It should be, and all you can really do is hope that it will be over these next 2 weeks. I mean, it already feels probably too late for any significant change in terms of people in their positions and things like that. So really, all they can do over this period, they can't sign any players. All they can do is have a long, hard think about where things are going. The actions they've taken, the course that's taken them on, and where possibly they could change course. Because certainly if things keep on going this way, it's only going to end up getting worse. As you said, I do get the sense sometimes that, as you say, when you're on the inside, you can find reasons for everything, and you can excuse everything with logic. And I suppose that's understandable if it's your job. I don't think anybody wants to sit around thinking about how bad they've been at their job and how much of a failure it's been over the last few years. But for me, it's the it's almost a loss of context now. It's how far away from competing for Championship promotion Norwich feel, and because it's happened over a gradual period of time and there's been so much change, it almost feels normal now that Norwich are where they are in the Championship table. And to think, at the start of the season, it almost felt a little bit too brave to say that Norwich should be competing for automatic promotion. They just spent whatever it was, 35 million pounds on players. They brought in a new head coach who got into the playoffs last season. They're definitely one of the biggest clubs at this level. And you look at their infrastructure, to be fair, I know they talk about it a lot, and maybe they're too excited about that when they should be thinking more about results on the pitch. But the infrastructure, to be fair, compared to a lot of the Championship clubs, is incredible. It is way better than a lot of the clubs who are higher than them in the table and who have a much better chance of getting promoted this season. So you look at all of those factors, and yet we're in a position now where it's ambitious to say Norwich City should be competing for the playoffs. Sometimes when I'm speaking to fans and I ask them, do you think Norwich can get into the playoffs? It feels like a bit of a silly question. And you look at that compared to the context of, even 5, 6, 7 years ago, fans were unhappy about the idea that Norwich wanted to sustain themselves as a top 26 club, and that was when the budget was much smaller, when, the owners had much less money than obviously the current owners had. And if you told people at that point, well, actually, top 26 is close to the best it's going to get, and actually it's going to get worse, and you're going to end up worrying that you're going to be slipping into League One in a few years' time, I think those fans and those people connected would have been absolutely horrified. So, because it happens gradually, and obviously this always happens at every club, you can kind of lose that context. But when you think about the opportunity that Norwich had to cement themselves towards the top of the Championship, even as a sort of Premier League club a few years ago, they wasted that opportunity, and now they've wasted all the momentum that they had at that time, and they're back to where they were 20 years ago, when they were just sort of, again, a run-of-the-mill Championship club. But like you said, they do have the opportunity now to do a bit of soul searching, to really think about the direction of this club. And actually, I heard Ange Postecoglou talking yesterday, his Nottingham Forest press conference, about how now sometimes when something isn't going well, you always just think, just end it, just change it, just sack the manager, just sell the players. And that's not always the solution. Sometimes the solution is just to be better at your job and to make better decisions and to think about things and where you can change course. It is possible to change course through thought and not through bringing different people in. So hopefully the people in the club at present have the ability to do that, really, because as of right now, it doesn't look like there's going to be any personnel change. So you're leaving it up to the people who have made mistakes over the last few months, and maybe it's good to have that consistency sometimes after the amount of change that they've had. But those people need to really think hard about where things have gone wrong over the last few months, over the last few years, and where they can change course, because that's the only way you get things better from here. If it keeps going on like this, Norwich is just going to get worse and worse.
And their roles within it as well. What it can't be is a constantly passing the buck around, and it was him or it was her or it was them, and it has to be individuals looking and reflecting candidly on the role that they've played over this, like you say, most of them over a prolonged period of time. Paddy, as Sam said, I think often, and I've always said this to you guys, whenever anything goes wrong in football, there's always kind of two solutions, and I think Ange Postecoglou maybe mapped it out yesterday. You either sack a head coach or a manager, or you sell or sign a load of players. Well, Norwich have tried in terms of managerial changes, and as we've mapped out, that hasn't shifted anything materially in terms of getting them upwardly mobile. And they've also changed a hell of a lot of players and spent a hell of a lot on players over recent years. But inevitably, when you have a bad run of results like this, and it's 5 defeats now in 8 in all competitions for them, and obviously 5 of their first 9 league games that they've lost, 19th in the table, 8 points from 9. You can continue that on. There are inevitably going to be question marks about the head coach, and that is obviously Liam Manning, somebody that Norwich City went out and got from a different club and paid compensation for him and for his coaching team, gave him a 4-year contract. There was a lot invested in terms of of him and his ability as a coach and his ability to outperform his resources. How culpable is he in this, or is it too simplistic to say this starts and stops with Liam Manning? And I'm guessing from the tone of our conversation in the opening half an hour, you're probably going to lean on the first question maybe more than the second.
Well, I mean, it's very difficult to gauge the apportioned element of blame, if you want to use that phrase, on Liam Manning's shoulders. You know, there are factors in his control, and that for me is what we're seeing on the pitch, or not seeing on the pitch, in terms of identity. And go back to what I said at the outset, you know, that ability to actually progress the ball to the opposition's penalty area to create chances for one of the best strikers in the division, that looks coherent, that looks a strategy that these players can execute. Not, let's get it straight, Portman Road was a very cohesive press, and it was just trying to play off that turnover opportunities at the top end of the pitch. They didn't fashion anything in that sense. You know, the goal, we've said it was a corner that went wrong in terms of a set piece, because it just drops to the edge of the box, and you know, maybe wrong is not quite accurate, because obviously Schwartau was in the right position, but still not a constructed goal in any sense of a coaching sense for me. So, and what we saw yesterday, we've seen every single game to greater or lesser degree this season under Liam Manning. That's now a body of work which is 9 games, League and Cup. So that's, for me, a sufficient sample to, by this stage, expect that head coach, backed by that coaching team, to have developed a playing style which wouldn't, I don't think, realistically be perfect, the finished article by this stage, but would be further along that path than we're seeing now. And how do we measure that? For me, very simple. We measure it in terms of points, goals, scored and conceded. And all of those measures do not cast Liam Manning's work in a favourable light. That's firmly at his door. That's on him. Now, the other areas we've talked about, recruitment. You know, the handbraking from Torup to Manning, for me, has left a very unbalanced, ill-defined squad. You know, there's Torup players in there that Manning's maybe trying to sort of reprogram a touch and point in a direction of how he wants them to play. There's Manning players brought in who are clearly struggling to maybe adapt to play with Torup level players. So all of that is a process that takes time, but there's no doubt that it feels like now, because you've had to recruit in 2 or 3 windows for 2 very different coaches. And of course, I know I can already hear it now. The pushback would be, well, we actually just sign players to fit whatever the methodology of how we set a tone of what we want to play as a club. And then the head coaches, to use Napper's terms, are interchangeable. But I think it's reasonable to assume that the head coaches, to a greater or lesser extent, will want a say in each recruitment cycle. So it's inevitable. You get this, at the moment, it feels a bit of a patchwork quilt of, look in wide areas, where are his options now? Look across the middle of the park in terms of creativity, where are the options? It doesn't feel like it's been a balanced recruitment cycle. So that's, I wouldn't solely say that's at Manning's door, but again, he has an input on that. And then the other key factor in this is the fitness and the recovery of players, which is very much not at Liam Manning's door. For me, as he said, and he's very frustrated, you can tell now, because he for me, almost came out and broke ranks there midweek. You know, he'd almost hinted at, when he confirmed Quisgard and Kraseni were out, how we'd have to look internally at our processes, to paraphrase what he said. Well, off the back of Slimani and off the back of Jallo, it was very clear that, I think he said something about, we've had tough conversations now, because he wants, as a head coach, all his best players available most weeks. And yes, okay, you're going to pick up injuries. That's the nature of it, particularly in the Championship. But I think it's beyond doubt now that the volume of muscular injuries over the last 12, 18 months do pose serious questions of those back office departments and what they are or aren't doing. We were told there was going to be a forensic audit over the summer. I think they're trying to recruit it for 1 or 2 positions. But here we are still. And how many players are out? So, for me, to go back to your original point, yes, Liam Manning is responsible directly for the playing elements and the style of play, but I think there's a lot of other factors that are not directly under his gift, and that's where it comes to, as a collective, these departments, these individuals. Liam Manning himself referenced it yesterday in terms of where do we go from here. He basically broadened it out, so he said every person at that football club needs to now examine what they're doing and do it better and come together and try and move this forward. So for me, implicit in those words is that he can see that, you know, it isn't simply him and his coaching staff and that playing group and the problems that are clearly there and that he is directly responsible for. It's a much broader canvas now of issues that overlap and interlink and need a lot of buy-in from far more people than just simply Liam Manning. But when push comes to shove, this is always about the shop window and what we do or don't see. And if that is continuing on this path, then Liam Manning will be gone sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and I mean, just to zoom in terms of what you said there in terms of recruitment, and completely agree. It feels to me, so much of squad building is about balance and squaring the circle, so to speak. You have to make sure that you've got a range of profiles, a range of different options, players who, a mix probably of risks and players that maybe have potential and high ceilings, combined with those maybe who can perform in the here and now. And by those, I think Harry Darling is proof that, often when you talk about that and speak about players of experience, people collate that with kind of 30-year-olds, plus-year-olds, where, there's no sell on. Actually, you can get both. And often you can find lots of players in the mid-teens to kind of the primes of their careers who are ready to contribute in the here and now and can offer you a lot of those qualities alongside sort of playing ability. And obviously, and this goes to the heart probably of our first part of this discussion, where, you remember that summer of 2023 where Norwich stacked their squad probably with too many of the latter ones, and there was no kind of future proofing there. To me, and I think this is maybe an issue that maybe hasn't been talked about quite a lot. You look at this squad at the moment, the amount of players who are either in year 1 or year 2 of Championship football, it's vast. There is so many of them, and you are expecting them as a collective, as a whole, to step up and form a team, and form not just a team, but a team that can compete towards the top end of the division. I think that's quite unrealistic, to be completely honest. There has to be a better balance of it, and to me, all of this at the moment just feels like a huge experiment, really, and like a talent production factory rather than a football club at present, which I think maybe feeds this idea that we're speaking about. And and when you're Liam Manning trying to piece that all together, it's difficult, and it feels like it's maybe a squad that's not suited to the head coach, and a head coach that isn't particularly suited to the players at this present moment. And you've got a lot of players in there who individually I think we would look at as good talents, as good players that have potential, players that maybe have been signed for a reason. I use this anecdote in my verdict, and again, I don't use it to bash Jose Cordoba. This isn't the point of that, but pretty much every week I write a thing called 6 Things on our website after every game. I take a number of interesting stats and stuff that is maybe a bit of a sideways look at the weekend and the game. And I can guarantee when I go on the websites and I filter it by progressive passes, if Jose Cordoba has played, he will be not just at the top of the list of Norwich City players. He will be so far and away from the top of the list. That was the case against Wrexham a couple of weeks ago, for example. So if you are leading on data, that's very interesting. That's a very interesting player profile there. But actually, I think all of us that watched the game, noticed he struggled. And again, there's context behind that in terms of he was out of position, and it was just difficult generally against Kabore. So there's again a lot of context to flush into that. But my point is that I think all of those players individually probably have flashed up good metrics and have shown good stuff. And when you recruit them, there's a lot of solid, sound reasons as to why they should be brought into the club as individuals. But then that has to overlay with a wider context of how you build a team and how you build a squad. And that is the aspect at the moment that for me feels a little bit difficult to knit together. Norwich have got a lot of good individuals that they've signed on a lot of merit and a lot of good data and whatnot. But actually how they all fit together as a piece in a jigsaw, that, Sam, feels a lot more disjointed and difficult. And ultimately Liam Manning gets judged on how well he can do that. But I think we're probably all looking at this squad at the moment. I mean, Norwich City, and Chris Gorham put this out, so I'm stealing this from him, really, finished 8 points off the relegation zone last season. Norwich have spent a lot of money, and I think 9 games in, and it's very early and premature to make judgments on any new signing at this stage, I think. But as a collective, this looks, and certainly the data shows you, this is, as things stand in this snapshot of time, is a worse team at the moment. That can't all be on Liam Manning, the processes that has led to that happening.
No, I was thinking about this earlier in terms of Manning, and obviously I know there's a big debate about his future and whether he should have gone after the Ipswich game. But when I really think about, all the reasons why fans were upset after the game yesterday, one of them is, the results and the things that have gone before his tenure, which obviously he can't do anything about. The other one is a club that I think increasingly they feel disconnected from, and they feel is increasingly corporate and not representative of them as a fan base, which again he isn't responsible for. And then third for me, and probably the biggest thing, is that squad of players. I think you mentioned the lack of cohesion between them and the fact it doesn't really feel like a balanced squad or a team that's knitted together particularly well. But I don't think it's even just that. I think the players they've got there are nowhere near worth what they've paid for them. And there are some there who could still come good. You know, I've seen with Ante Cianats, for example, the comparison with Josh Sargent, where he struggled for his first year and then had a couple of injuries where he was a decent player and then eventually goes on to become obviously one of Norwich's better players. But he was recruited for a similar amount of money when Norwich were in the Premier League. He'd already played in the Bundesliga and he was struggling properly out of position, in a position you'd say doesn't suit his strengths whatsoever. Whereas Cianats came into a Championship side for £8.5 million. He's been played all over the place to try and suit him and suit his abilities, and he hasn't found any form whatsoever. £8.5 million, no matter whether there's a future bonus in terms of ability and whether you expect him to become a £30 million player in the future. Even though he arrived when he was 20 years old, he'd never played in the Championship before. For that amount of money, you should be at least delivering more than he has so far at this level. You look at some of the other players in this squad. Mirko Topic, what was it? Was it the package is $4 million? Is it? And he, to me, he looks fine, but he just looks like a fine Championship midfielder who can.
But yeah, and sorry to jump in, but also on him, you look at him and Palamatson next to each other, and you go, how on earth were these two players that they were looking at for the same position? Because they're entirely different, right, in terms of the skill set. And I mean, even the Palamatson pursuit in itself, they spent a lot of time haggling over not much money to then sign a different player. Then Nunez goes. Then they end up paying what Silkeborg wanted for Matson anyway. He comes in, and then it feels like he's ahead of Topic anyway. So all of that feels odd as a case in point.
And I think they've done that a few times now. I think they've spent a lot of money by Championship standard. It doesn't feel like a lot of money when you're looking at the Norwich team versus Ipswich team and some of the players that they've got and the fees that they've spent on those players. But you have to remember the amount that Norwich have spent on Mirko Topic. There are still several Championship clubs who have never spent that amount of money on one single player in their history, who can't even think about spending that on a player. And yet he's one of the, he's not exactly a standout buy in terms of how much he cost Norwich. Mate Jurasek, I know he's finally hitting the performance levels, but for me, £5.8 million, even if he does go on to finally get up to the levels that Norwich hope, in a year's time, and they sell him on for 20 million, 5.8 million for me is someone who should be coming into the Championship and delivering straight away. And I think we can talk about the patterns of the recruitment and the balance and finding, the right amount of Championship experience in the market. And I agree with you; they haven't done that. There's a wider problem with the squad and its balance and its creation. But I also just think, player to player, the amount of money they've spent on this squad is extraordinary. And I was looking at those two sides, on the team sheet yesterday, and for me, 7 of Ipswich's bench get into Norwich's starting lineup. And I know Ipswich have been up and they've spent a lot of money, but Norwich have also been up in the last few years. They're still a club that I think a lot of Championship fans feel are relatively money compared to them, and they definitely are. So I think for me, although we can talk about patterns and the wider issues with recruitment, and I do agree with you, I think also you just have to look pound for pound at the recruitment and the fact that this squad of players just isn't worth, for me, anywhere near what they've paid for them.
There's two different aspects to recruitment. There's spotting a good player, spotting a good talent, and then there's spotting a good player within the context of building a team. And it feels like Norwich have done a lot of A and probably not enough of B to balance that off. And don't get me wrong, in every squad, in Norwich's context, you can afford to have a few players in a few positions that they're risks, they're gambles, they're high ceiling, low floor, or low floor, high ceiling, even that you take a bit of a gamble on. But when that is in a lot of positions, I mean, for example, you look at someone like Jakov Medic, who, again, I know you referenced, who can't, at the moment is out of the team because Norwich want to play with a higher line. So again, you question why they've brought in a player who struggles or prevents them from doing that because of his mobility, and we could go on and on and on in this conversation. And I mean, Paddy, it's actually, I just had a look. It's actually 2 years to the day today, as we sit here today, October the 6th, 2023, was when Ben Napper didn't take up his role, but it was announced that he would be taking up his role as sporting director. And I think it's fair to say, there's, as much as we've just spoken about Liam Manning, just done a section on recruitment, there's a lot of heat on him as well for where this has gone. And actually, you look at, I'll give you a few examples over the last couple of years, but David Wagner, keeping him until the end of the season, ultimately that was the right decision. They got in the playoffs. Then they, as you say, they went to change. He went for his own man, Johannes Torup. They pursued him heavily from the start of 2024 to actually when he came in. They paid compensation for him. The decision, whether it was his, whether it was Ben Napper's, whether it was the club's, whoever it was irrelevant. But the decision not for him essentially to not work with anyone that he'd worked with before was strange. Then to bring in Jack Wilshere as a coach initially felt like a good idea. Norwich then a few months later sack Johannes Torup 8 months into a 3-year contract as part of a bigger thing. Jack Wilshere gets the interim job, feels like he's kind of being warmed up and given an opportunity to impress for the head coach's role. I think there's very good reasons as to why he wasn't, but ultimately he then leaves because he isn't given the job. That whole year feels incredibly strange. You could even micro it in terms of I'll continue along this path first, but then they go and get Liam Manning, who's very different to Johannes Torup, but has more of a championship pedigree, and they try and make that correction. He brings in staff of his own. And here we are. But within that, there's the context of other decisions. I'd even boil it down. And again, I don't want to pick on individuals, but the decision to convert Anis Ben Slimani's loan deal into a permanent deal in the January, when they didn't have to do that. They could have waited till the summer. When if they'd have done that, they would have known it wouldn't have been Johannes Torup. And he's now a player that they're trying to shift on. That's just one example, and several examples, I guess, of a broader point. It's I guess all of that probably is in the context of what we've spoken about, that coherence, that stability, that consistency probably of idea that just hasn't ran through so far his tenure of being a sporting director. And of course, I context this, it's his first job. It's a very difficult job to do. I don't envy him. It's you make decisions and you live and die by those. But I guess in the context of all of that, and in the context of these 2 years, you can probably understand why there are question marks being pushed at his door as well.
I don't think he's going to be coming to your door for his PR, Connor. After that takedown, you've really shone a lot of light on the Napper tenure. I will say, in the interest of balance here, there's one area he has got right: player sales.
Completely. Yeah,
Adam Eder, the deal he got from Celtic, you cannot argue that was good business. John Rowe, excellent money off the back of where these players have gone in their careers subsequently. They've not gone up, they've gone the other way. At best, they've plateaued. Abu Kamara, extracting the money he did from Hull for a player who did nothing really in a Hull shirt and is now out on loan in Spain. And even this summer, Ball Science, a player who walked through the door, free agent, thanks to Stuart Webber, and exercising a relegation clause. They sell him, turn him around, sell him on for 14 plus mil. Even the deal for Zara, which could again escalate if he goes on from Galatasaray. So in that area of his craft, and the reaction to all of those deals, what was the reaction towards Ben Napper specifically around all those deals from the Norwich fan base, that this guy is a very astute operator in the transfer market? Sadly, we haven't seen that deftness thus far in terms of inward business, and that really is the thrust of where you were going at it in terms of his work in the transfer market. But for me, the key element is the most important decisions he's made are twofold, and they're the head coaches. And at the moment, by his measure, because he got rid of him, he got Torup wrong. And at the moment, Liam Manning isn't suggesting that was a good call either. That questions his judgment. I put that very point to him in the summer, post Torup, that you've got to get the next one right, because this is now clearly directly a test of your judgment. He didn't disagree with that summation, and he will know that if Liam Manning has to be jettisoned, then that's not going to leave him in a very good position, I would suggest, with the American ownership, because probably the most important thing he has to get right is in the whole complex brief that he has as a sporting director across many different or spheres of the footballing operation at that football club. The most important decisions he makes are his head coach, because the head coach is then what is going to extract, as he said, Liam Manning would hopefully do, the most from the resource he's got available, put a product on the pitch which the fans can buy into, a product on the pitch which is successful in terms of Norwich and hopefully going on to achieve promotion back to the Premier League, but also successful in terms of player trading models, which is a key pillar for this football club. So the most important part of his job for me, if you strip it right back, is the head coaches. At the moment, it's not looking too good. And that's why there's so much focus, I'm afraid, on Ben Napper and his operation in these 2 years. You know, there's good elements of what he's done. And I've already referenced, I think, the best element in terms of player trading outward. But I don't think the measure of a sporting director should be how much he maximises player sales. It should be how good are the head coach appointments he's made and how good is the work inward in terms of recruitment. And on those areas, 2 years in, if we were to stop now and provide a definitive assessment, I don't think you find anybody who says he's doing a good job in those 2 years.
And this sort of comes on to my next point, and a question I'll pose to both of you. And look, hindsight is the easiest form of analysis, I guess, and it's easy to wrap around the context of where we currently are. To be honest, I don't think this is particularly a conversation with hindsight, because I think we were having a lot of it at the time. So I'll start with you, Sam. But the decision to sack Johannes Hoftar, I don't particularly want to reopen that. But clearly what has happened since then in terms of the expectation level has been very clearly defined in terms of top six. All that is being done at this moment in time is people is judging them against that. But is there any part of you that feels like that wasn't the right thing to do, that maybe they've got themselves in a bit of bother with that identity and with where they find themselves, in part because they blew up what was meant to be? I think Glenn Riddisholm on this podcast said it shortly after he was appointed in Austria, that it was kind of a 3-year plan, or did they simply have no choice? Because you look back at, this is kind of how I boil it down, you look back to the first Farke season, and look, we don't know what Torup year 2 would have been like. We could have been sat here in exactly the same place with exactly the same players, and you know, the solution maybe would have been a lot simpler. But I think Farke ended that season with about 3 wins in 17 or something. They lost on the final day 5-1 to Sheffield Wednesday. It's not unreasonable to suggest if that would have been the same situation but with Ben Napper instead of Stuart Webber, Daniel Farke could have gone, and that's the reality of the situation. They then had a slow start, and clearly they picked up to win the league. And again, I'm not saying this with Torup would have been Farke, they would have won the championship, all would have been well in the world. But your mind does wonder on where they'd be now if they did make that decision to stick instead of twist.
Yeah, and I see that's where a lot of Norwich fans' heads are going as well. And you know, I can't say I don't feel the same, really. I think looking back to when they did get rid of him, and as you said, I don't think it's particularly just with hindsight that we're saying it was a bit of a confusing decision, because the shock that I think we probably all felt when we first heard suggestions that it was going to happen, I think tells you the story. There was a reason we were completely shocked. You know, if it was the case that you can't possibly as a club ride out that set of results without getting rid of the head coach, then none of us would have been surprised when he'd gone. And particularly those parallels with the Farke era, I think that's why the fan base now particularly is looking back and saying, you know, maybe it wasn't the best decision. And I saw actually, I can't remember who it was from, so I apologise, but there was a good set of numbers actually from the Torup era that showed his team were outperforming the results they were getting on the pitch in terms of the chances they were creating, even defensively, when they looked a bit of a shambles at times, to be honest, and they conceded obviously loads and loads of goals. They were a little bit unlucky in that sense as well. And I don't think things were quite as bad as maybe the results in the league table suggested at the time. Obviously, you can talk about the man management element. I think I don't think it's saying anything controversial or new really now to say that probably Torup didn't have as good a grasp on the dressing room as Ben Napper would have liked at the time. But that was also kind of the case with Farke. I think there were a few players in that dressing room at the time who probably weren't having him and who he didn't want as part of the group either. And what they did was they backed their head coach. They sold the players who maybe didn't align with what Farke wanted and weren't likely to buy into it in a big way. Whereas, this time around, they've done it the other way around. And the whole reason why
they've changed both, haven't they? Let's be honest. They've changed the coach and the players, really.
Yeah. So this is, I think I've made this criticism since then as well, that, if you were going to get rid of half the players anyway, what's the point in sacking the head coach because he couldn't motivate the players, or because the players weren't buying into what he wanted to do, kind of thing. And I think it all just goes back to why we were so shocked when that Torup decision was made. And it's because we could see a situation like this, because you go into a big long-term project and you talk about, how it's going to take time and it's going to take years. When you all of a sudden pivot to, no, it's not good enough that he wasn't delivering straight away, you feed that expectation into fans. Like you said, they were talking a lot about top six. It was very, very clear their playoff ambition. And I wonder if part of that was kind of explaining the decision to sack Torup in retrospect. But certainly with the sacking decision and with the communications that followed it, they've set such a high bar. And even though Manning has gone in and been relatively successful with a little bit of time at his previous clubs, it's very difficult for any manager to come in with a squad that finished 13th last season, plus 12 new signings, and hit the ground running. But ultimately, I don't think it's fans' fault that they expect what they're told to expect.
Paddy, what's your view on that aspect of maybe what some fans are talking about around Torup?
Well, I wouldn't disagree with either of what you two gentlemen have said. To be that willing to move on. I'm trying to think back now when Wagner was dismissed the day after the Leeds second leg playoff debacle. I think the statement was something along the lines of, we're going in a new direction, wasn't it? I think Ben Napper quoted as saying, well, this needs to be new, fresh, different to what we've done before. And boy, did he deliver in terms of unveiling Torup. So why rip that up in 10 months? I don't think that the justification has ever really held for me. That all the underlying metrics were going in the wrong direction. Sam's right. The man management was clearly a factor, but you back your manager. You don't back your playing staff in that scenario, because if the players hold the whip hand, then you get probably what we're getting now, if the truth be told. So, but Ben Napper made that call. There was another. I mean, it's no surprise. Some of the business, let's get it straight. Some of the business that's come in this summer was very much on the agenda for Riddisholm and Torup, very clearly. Matthias Quisgaard, and there's an obvious example. But some of the other bits of business that's come through the door was being formulated when those two were still in post. So this is going back to my previous point that Manning's almost trying to deal with maybe types of recruitment that wouldn't necessarily be the players he'd have gone and sourced. And it's very difficult to do everything you want to do in one window. So, yeah, of course, nobody can tell with hindsight. We may well have been in this scenario with Torup. It might have started poorly, and the same residual issues defensively with him were still there, and he hadn't resolved them. And in which case, if the axe had fallen now, then nobody could have disputed it. There'd have been none of the pushback from anybody who was pro Torup, because he'd have had a significant portion of time now. But for it to be moved on quite so abruptly when you've already badged this as a new era and a new direction, it just raises more question marks about the judgment of the sporting director ultimately. So what he needed was, in that context, Liam Manning to come in, and despite, as Sam rightly says, picking up a team that finished mid-table and then 12 new players, he needed a good start. He hasn't had a good start, and that's why this narrative is now taking hold. Why did you get rid of Torup if this is all that was coming down the track? They would have clearly hoped for the opposite to be the case, and that Manning's record as a very almost person who can fast track the process, and albeit maybe every single club he's been at, the initial start has been a bit patchy, but thereafter the pace has been picked up. Well, maybe that's where they're at right now, that they now expect in this next cycle under Manning, because that's what he's done at his other clubs, that the pace does get picked up. But there's a hell of a lot of hope based on those sort of prophecies coming to pass, because the actual circumstantial evidence is that this isn't going to be suddenly getting turbocharged. He had an opportunity this past week. We said that going into West Brom and Ipswich. Okay, it's been nowhere near good enough. You're the first to admit it. It's a results industry you're in, but you've got two opportunities now. That Carrow Road curse, lift that, bounce into the derby, you get a result, and on you go. Well, we sat here the other side of that. They've lost both games, and nothing has materially changed in terms of the style of play. So that's an opportunity for me squandered to turbocharge this season. How many more is Napper and Manning going to get?
Yeah, and I think for me, I mean, you mentioned improvement. I mean, from where they're at the moment, and you look at the points per game and all of the numbers that we went into in great deal from that Stoke weekend, they've not really changed. Norwich is still in the bottom six for most of those, as you'd expect after two defeats. I mean, they've conceded nearly an XG of 10 since they last won a game of Championship football, which is incredibly poor, really. Two goals a game, essentially, which again is kind of what we're seeing. So the performances haven't really improved, the numbers haven't really improved, and if we're talking about a level of improvement, again, based on where they want to go, Norwich are going to need to improve to get themselves out of where they are at the moment. So then we're kind of talking mid-table level. Then they're going to have to kick on again to get themselves in a conversation for a top six. That feels like a hell of a climb from what is a very, very low floor if they are going to do that. And look, if they do it, brilliant. What a story it will be, and what and I think all of these conversations about identity and whatnot would definitely be put on the back burner. Although I think, as David Wagner proved, if that doesn't come with improvement in performances, then it will remain in the background. But that's going to take a hell of a jump, I think, for any head coach. So I think basically the crux of this conversation, and you guys shout if you're different, is that look, Norwich can change a head coach. They can go through that cycle again. They can hire a fifth one since relegation, and the next 3 months might be a little bit better. The next 6 months might be a little bit better. They might finish 10th. There might be optimism and encouragement. Ultimately, it kind of feels, and this is where I guess all of it kind of comes back to. It kind of feels like we're going to be here again with Norwich, doesn't it? And that's where I think the point of the conversation needs to shift and change, and why I necessarily don't think there are footballing issues with this team, but I don't think it's as simple as remove Liam Manning, get someone else in, and away you go. I think that, as we've touched upon, there needs to be probably bigger stuff, and that doesn't, as Paddy said, that doesn't necessarily mean, I think people always equate that as being, oh well, X needs to lose their job and Y needs to lose their job. You can do that with continuity and just with different processes and structures, but I need to see a little bit of that now if that's going to be the route that they go down. And I guess finally, chaps, just to kind of end the pod and the conversation, we've got to talk about some of the Carrow Road redevelopment that is coming down the track. And Sam, I mean, I'll start with you. We mentioned this in terms of a communication point and in terms of when it was released, and clearly there's a planning permission element to this, and understand all of that in terms of wanting to get it out there, and 2 days before a derby and whatnot. I guess again, none of it helps the conversation when you've got a situation where there's a lot of people in the River End, and I'll talk about this in a moment because I used to sit in the stand that it's affecting, so I feel to an extent slightly qualified to speak about. I've got family in there as well, so that's one element. But for me also, that people moving out of the south stand so they can accommodate more kind of premium seating. You've already got one of, if not the most expensive season ticket in the Championship. It's you can unveil a fan zone and talk about the development of the City stand, but for so many of those people, particularly in that River End, it is more than a seat. And I think, as Paddy said earlier, and this, I feel really sorry actually for the supporters group and for the Canaries Trust, where maybe the sort of line is there's been consultation about this, but consultation for me is a debate, not kind of someone saying this is happening, what do you think about it? That's not a consultation really. If you're going to do it, I just feel incredibly sorry really for the people that it's affecting, because and there was actually a brilliant post on our message board, and it's not something we say too often, but there was an excellent post on there from somebody who sit in the River End, and they used to go to football with I maybe have to find the name when you're speaking, but it was a really emotive post about how they used to sit next to their friend in the River End. They used to go to football together, and their friend sadly passed away, and so now sitting in the River End, sitting in those seats, watching Norwich City, that's kind of the only connection they have left with their friend, and that is a big part of it. And I just think whatever the note, I think two things can be true at once. It's great to have that ambition to want to improve Carrow Road, to want to improve the stadium, and it's something that lots of people have been calling out for a long time. I just think maybe it could have been handled a little bit better than maybe the first those people learn about it being the time that it drops really, and an email that comes after the announcement. What did you make of how it's all unfolded in the last few days?
Yeah, I think I agree with pretty much everything you've said there. Really, I think obviously the club, to be fair, have considered at some point the emotional impact it will have on people, and I think they will, and they did acknowledge, to be fair, beforehand that it's more than just the inconvenience of having to sit somewhere else and maybe pay more, which, by the way, is another big problem with it, is that they'll have to pay to sit somewhere else, maybe more expensive for a lot of them. But I think there was an acknowledgement that there was an emotional connection to those seats for a lot of those fans, but probably not enough of one. I think that's where a lot of the problem comes in for me, is that you can consider all of the elements, but you need to find them in balance. And I don't think, with the way that things have been handled, they've quite appreciated how much a lot of these, a lot of people who sit in these seats will value those seats and will cherish them. Obviously, there's that story you told from the message board, but it won't just be them. I've seen similar ones on social media. There will be dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of people who have similar stories and similar emotional connections to those seats, who will now feel that they've got nothing really to symbolize the years they've spent sitting there, or the relationships with people. And there's also the element of people who didn't know each other before they sat in those seats, but see each other every week, and have become friends over that time, and will miss seeing each other every week. So there are a few reasons why it has an emotional impact, and I think it also just plays into a bigger picture of, and I referenced it earlier, the corporate nature of the football club. And I think a lot of fans, to be fair, are realistic about the fact that it would have been hard to continue competing on the pitch, without a little bit more investment and without the kind of ownership structure changing. But they were told when Norfolk Holdings came in, and when there was this big change, that they had been selected, and that this process had taken place because there was such an understanding of family and of the values of the club that defined, the Delia Smith era, really. And I think, to be fair, the ownership group they haven't been Chancery levels or anything like that. There are a lot of owners who've done a lot worse in the Championship, but it does feel like this is becoming more of a business, more of a corporate entity than the family club and the I suppose family is probably the best way to put it, really, in terms of how it was before. I think they so far could have struck a better balance between trying to increase the revenue and trying to ultimately help the product on the pitch in that way, but also bringing fans along with them. And I'm left wondering whether, when you consider the amount that they're spending on players, the amount that's available upon promotion, the amount they're spending on wages every week and on players, you almost wonder if it's worth all of this negative PR and all of the upset you cause to the fans and this bad feeling, just for maybe a few million extra over a long period of time to kind of invest in things. And I think that's where I am really is that ultimately money is a big part of football. You can't get away from that, but you have to find a balance, especially with a club like Norwich City that's been run in such a family way and so well over the last few decades, really. And I think that's why it stings, particularly for Norwich fans.
Yeah, and Paddy, I mean, to bounce it to you, I mean, us Norfolk folk don't like change at the best of times. And as I say, I think two things can be true at once. That want and ambition to improve Carrow Road and improve the experience that fans have, I think is very applaudable. I think the fan zone, for example, is a brilliant idea, a brilliant use of the space that they've got. And I think when open, that will be a fantastic facility that people will use on a match day, providing they can work out how to heat it in the middle of winter, which is a different challenge in itself. But I think the idea, the concept is excellent. So, you have to applaud that want to keep innovating and improving. But again, it's probably that feeling in terms of how it's been handled for those fans that maybe are being turfed out of seats that, emotionally and emotionally mean a lot to them and are key parts of their life, really.
Yeah, I mean, I won't add anything too much to what's already been said. I mean, the reality is, at the heart of this is we need to generate revenue to get to the Premier League, to then stay in the Premier League. Now, there's no fan that I'm aware of who would push back on that, because they don't just want to get to the Premier League, and what a ride that would be, certainly from the base they're at now, to go on, but they want to stay there. They want to try and build on that again. And this is a plank that the people who matter at the football club, driving the direction of travel, think can help them achieve that. So what you're then trying to do, and it loops back round to everything we've discussed today, is you take your fan base, the most important constituency in your football club. Generationally, they were here before you, they'll be here after you, and their family and their family. You take them on the journey with you. Telling people after the event that this is happening and sending them an email and saying but there'll be a chance to address your concerns to whoever down the track, that's not taking them on the journey. That's dragging them by the collar of the neck. And that's why there's been so much pushback. And it's not enough to say that they've consulted this body, that body. For something as seismic as this, as turfing 3,500 fans out of seats in the stadium, some who've had that for 10, 15, 20 years, the family, the personal stories around that, to do it in this way is a spectacular own goal.
Yeah, and again, I won't name them, but someone who thinks a lot of Norwich City and vice versa, who said to me there's been a lot of own goals in the last year, and that kind of maybe feels where it is. And look, sorry, this has been a bit of a longer pod than usual. I didn't really want to leave anything sort of on the table for us to speak about, but I did want to end on this point. And look, the lads have kind of summed it up in a really articulate way, and I don't have too much to add other than, you know, I sat in the Lower River End as a season ticket holder. It was my first time having a season ticket in the second half of that League One season that obviously culminated in promotion, and the journey that then followed on the Paul Lambert in some really bad times as well. I used to go with my sister, who still sits there. My dad now has a season ticket in there as well, and you know, there were guys in there who, again, I know are still there now, who sit to the left of you, the right of you, behind you, in front of you, 2 rows, 3 rows down, that you see every match day, that you speak to, that you kind of share views on and have a laugh with, and maybe have a laugh at times as well, and in terms of some of those opinions. And all of that forms the concept of your match day, and actually your block and your row and those people next to you become a huge part of your footballing experience, and emotionally that's a key part as well. And there'll be people similarly to that PinkUn forum poster who have lost people along the way who used to sit in those seats, and you know, every time they step into Carrow Road and into that stand and into that terrace and down that row and onto that seat, we'll think about the people that used to make that journey with them. And that's why it is so emotive. And yeah, and like I said, I feel for the people who, like the supporters panel, who, again, we don't know what has been discussed because so much of it was confidential, but I just hope they were able to have opinions and share those opinions forthright, and ultimately I suspect they were probably told this is kind of happening come what may. But it's a shame that, as you say, Paddy, more of those people weren't brought on the journey, because actually I think if they would have been brought on that journey, and it was with the idea of, look, we need to raise more money because we're in the Championship, and you know, money's too tight to mention, as we know, and ultimately the end goal of trying to get back in the Premier League, trying to develop the City stand, all of that stuff. I think there is a story to be told there that would have brought people along the way. So it's a shame that this has kind of been the reaction to something that has been really long awaited, and actually should be a real period of excitement for people, rather than maybe what it has been, which is disappointment and probably a little bit of anger as well. And I hope those people get the opportunity to give their opinions. And as we say, there's a consultation evening that the club are holding on the 15th, that hopefully a lot of people will go down and make those opinions heard to them as well. It's been a long pod, gents. Thank you very much for joining me. Hopefully we've left no stone unturned there in terms of discussing where Norwich City are at in the wake of that Derby Day defeat, whilst hopefully not mentioning too much about the game itself. We've got through a whole pod, and I don't think we've mentioned Marcelino Nunez, which is good. So that's progress. And yeah, it's going to be a long international break, I think, now, before obviously we come back against Bristol City, where I think at Carrow Road, where the expectation is going to be that we see some improvement. PinkUn.com, the place to go throughout the break. We'll have all of the views, news, and everything in between of that over the next couple of weeks. Thank you very much for listening and watching. We'll see you in the next one.